Hey, hey, Facebook, friends of the Fayetteville Observer, readers, fans, and everybody. We are here at the North Carolina Department of Environmental Quality to talk about the subject of GenX. GenX, if you haven't heard of it, is a compound that is made by the Chemours factory, which is in Bladen County. If you're familiar with Bladen County, it's right off of North Carolina 87. Actually, the plant is between 87 and the Cape Fear River. They make GenX there and then they take it to other places where it's made for use to make non-stick cookware and other items like that. It has been linked in animal studies to several forms of cancer and other illnesses and things like that, but it is not known whether or not those effects are the same in humans. So it was originally found, the Wilmington Star News broke the story back in June, that it was in the Cape Fear River, and Chemours shortly after that, at DEQ's urging, agreed to stop discharging GenX into the river, and later on they agreed to stop discharging all of their manufacturing wastewater, I think, into the river. But then after that, it was found in some wells there on the Chemours property, and then later on in some private wells and some lakes and a creek, and then just a few weeks ago, the rainwater around the plant. This past Sunday, we ran a story that talked about how some residents are concerned about eating some of their food that is grown in their gardens around the plant. And so that's one of the issues we're going to talk about briefly, and then we're going to kind of get just a wrap up of the entire situation. So that's what I thought I would. The first question is, what for those folks who've been eating their collards and cabbage around the plant for years and years. First, has there been any testing of fruits or vegetables like that? And if not, is there any plans, or kind of what is the situation regarding that?
Well, thank you for that question, Steve. An excellent one. I know it's something that's on the minds of lots of the citizens in the area. I wanted to first say thank you on behalf of the department for this opportunity to connect with the citizens in the community. And I'm going to toss the actual question over to Michael Scott.
Thank you. Thank you, Steve, also for this opportunity. As Sheila stated, to answer your question, there's not been any testing as of yet of fruits and vegetables or of surrounding gardens around the Chemours Fayetteville Works facility. The Department of Environmental Quality is actively engaged, the Department of Health and Human Services, and also the North Carolina Department of Agriculture on this specific subject, and also trying to address the concerns that you just mentioned, and also to identify the necessary next steps.
Okay, very good. And by the way, just in way of introduction, this is Shelia Holman, who is the Assistant Secretary for Environment for the Department of Environmental Quality, and Michael Scott, who is the Director of the Division of Waste Management.
That's correct.
For the Department of Environmental Quality. Well, let me ask you this. So I guess the next thing is, I know that y'all have studied, the story mentioned that y'all are studying and looking at research that's been done in other areas where you've looked at other fruits, or the other areas have looked at fruits and vegetables that have been contaminated with similar substances. What have you learned from that, and does that tell you anything about the possibility here?
So great question, Steve. These are emerging compounds that we're looking at, and we are gleaning through the literature, what's available within the United States, but also worldwide. What we found are that with some of the older compounds, what are often referred to as the C8 compounds, or PFOA specifically, that they can be taken up from the soil into plants. The big question is how they move in plants, or how they are translocated. A lot of that information, as I stated, in the literature is related to the older, or what we call legacy compounds. We are in an active discussion with the Netherlands which is looking at GenX in the environment, also in that particular country, and also its presence or possibility of its presence in food crops. So those are some of the next steps we're going through, what's available in the literature, what conclusions have been reached, and what's specific in the literature references GenX, the compound of concern from the Fayetteville Works facility.
Okay. Well, let's just in general, kind of to wrap up the food issue, what would you say to the folks who live in the area who might be wondering whether or not it's okay to eat their collards or their honey or things like that?
I would say, Steve, we want the community to know that we hear their concerns, and we're working on this on a daily basis and working on it diligently, and across several state departments, from Department of Health and Human Services, as I've referenced, Department of Agriculture, and also our Department of Environmental Quality. And it's a collaborative effort, a huge amount of expertise within those three departments, actively working on this question at hand. Where else are these compounds present, and what are the concerns related to whether they are potentially in food crops or in other parts of the environment like soil. That we're working on it diligently, and we're working on this every day to get folks the answers they're requesting.
Okay. I know one other thing is that y'all are looking at possibly testing some fish from a nearby lake. I think Marshwood Lake, I think it is. So kind of what led you to do that, and what is the status of those tests, and what do you think you'll find?
Sure. So, as you know, Steve, I think you've been to our 4 community information sessions. We've been trying to share the information related to the Fayetteville Works plant with the communities in Bladen, Cumberland, and also in Robeson counties. And we heard from the communities that more information related for the potential for bioaccumulation of these compounds was needed. So the department made the decision to test fish in a close by lake, as you mentioned, just north of the plant. And we're really appreciative of the community's willingness to help us do that and to partner with us in collecting those fish tissue samples. We did collect them on Wednesday of this week, so the tissue samples have been collected. They're being processed and will be sent to the lab this week for analysis. We probably will be in the month of April towards the latter point before we can really speak to that data, but it's one more step forward in answering the questions that the communities have and have relayed to us during the information sessions, and have also relayed to you guys, the Fayetteville Observer.
Yeah. So it'll be the tests are similar, I guess, to the well test where the lab has to look at it and kind of figure it out.
Yeah.
Okay. Now another thing, I think y'all are either planning on or have done air tests there in the area. What's the latest on that? And when do you think you'll get results of that?
Well, as you know, Steve, we started looking at the possible sources of contamination off-site when we saw wells that were upgraded from what you would traditionally think of the groundwater flow, and began looking into the role of the air emissions and in the contamination. To further that, we've required Chemours to go out and do testing, what's called stack testing, to have a better quantification of the emissions of GenX. And what that will help us do is better understand how much is going into the atmosphere. Those stack tests were conducted, there was some shakedown work in mid-January. There were testing done the week of January 22nd, I believe, and January 29th. And right now, the way that process works, the company contracts with a private consultant. First, they have to provide what's called a stack test protocol to the Division of Air Quality. And our experts in stack testing review that protocol and either ask for changes
to be sure it was actually going to measure what. Right?
Yes, and I should say that there was no clear way to do this testing. So there was a collaborative effort with EPA, the company, and DEQ to define that protocol. Mm-hmm. So we've been working with EPA on the air front as well. So first we reviewed the protocol, requested some changes, ultimately approved it, and then the company hired a consultant to go and actually conduct the stack testing. When that stack testing was being done, we had Division of Air Quality staff on site observing it, making sure that the protocol was followed. Then the company goes back and the consultant firm goes back, analyzes the results. I would say that there were 2 samples taken, one that would go to the lab, the consultant lab for Comores, and then 1 sample went to EPA. So we'll be getting tests back from 2 labs. As you know, we've done that a lot during the course of this investigation. Once stack testing is conducted, it's usually several weeks before we get the report, and so we're expecting a report literally in the next few days for the first couple of weeks. Stack testing continues at the company because there's several emission points there, so the weeks that have been tested, that was for certain process stacks, and so there's more work to do in that arena.
Okay, so any time you could get the initial results from the first, and then it'll keep coming in.
Right.
Okay. Now I know several weeks ago, a week or 2 ago at least, there was y'all reported that there had that GenX had been found in the rainwater. Can you just briefly tell me what those results were, or what any idea what that means as far as where the contamination may be coming from?
Right. So we had a rain event in the weekend, I think it was around January 28th, when we went and did a sampling around the facility. So we had 10 rain samplers that were placed at various points. The forecast for that rain event had the winds going in several different directions. So we wanted to try and capture all the possible locations that GenX could be deposited out through the rainwater. We had one site where I think the value was around 630 parts per trillion. It was just west of the facility and lined up well with where we thought we might see the highest concentration based on the predicted wind patterns. We had several that were non-detect, and we had several that were, say less than 100 parts per trillion. So we did have one that was, the highest one was 630 parts per trillion.
Okay.
We continue to collect samples. We're also requiring Comores to do some sampling of the rainwater on site, but these were literally immediately off site of the property.
Okay.
We're continuing to set up a more permanent deposition network, if you will, some permanent sites northeast of the facility and southwest of the facility. What it's telling us is that the idea that the air emissions are being deposited out through rainwater is in fact true.
Okay. And you said it was 630 parts per trillion. I know the Department of Health and Human Services has established a provisional health goal of 140 parts per trillion. And but that is generally for drinking water, right? So
that's correct. Yeah. So we don't necessarily compare, or we don't compare the rain deposition data to that drinking water standard.
Right. Right. Yeah, because they wouldn't be drinking the rainwater generally, wouldn't it?
Right.
Okay. So now, also, I think that y'all are planning to maybe do some soil tests. What's the status of that, and what's going to be going on?
So I'll let Michael touch on that one.
Sure. So, Steve, I think we discussed, previously that there was an initial round of soil testing done late last year at the Fayetteville Works facility on site. There was additional assessment work after we realized that these different perfluorinated compounds, GenX and others, were in the groundwater. That additional assessment work was required to include additional soil testing at the facility. There has not been soil testing off-site yet, so our focus is characterizing the true extent of these compounds within the Fayetteville Works facility, and as we've discussed, looking at the next steps to include characterizing the levels of these compounds and other media off-site to include soil. But at this time, off-site soil sampling has not been conducted yet.
Okay, and you don't have the results from the ones there yet, is that right?
We did receive the on-site soil test results, the additional on-site soil testing results. Those results were still under review. There's a few pieces of laboratory information we're still requesting from Comores to complete our review on that particular submittal, but we have received that, and it's currently under review by our staff.
Okay. Well, what is the latest on the actual test of the private wells? I know y'all started, I think it was a mile within the actual plant itself, and y'all were testing private wells, and then you went out to a mile from the property boundary, and then maybe another half mile and another half mile or something like that. Kind of what's the latest on the test of the private wells in the area?
Sure. So as you've alluded to, Steve, taking a phased approach radius-wise from the center of the plant and then working out certain distances from the plant property boundary itself. The status is we're within what we refer to as phase 4 of private well sampling with Chemours and their consultant. The current distance is approximately 2.5 miles out from the plant boundary, with the current focus being in the north and northeast areas and to the southwest. What I will share with you is we're getting in this phase 4 data. It is not complete yet, but we are seeing some encouraging trends, meaning lower numbers of wells that exceed the provisional health goal of 140 parts per trillion. If you remember back for the early phases of sampling, there were approximately 1/3 wells would be over the provisional health goal, 1/3 of the wells would be non-detect for no GenX, and 1/3 that had GenX but less than the provisional health goals. We are seeing in this phase 4 sampling those numbers above the provisional health goal percentages decrease, and that is a piece of good news for sure. But the testing continues. Phase 4 is not concluded yet. When it is concluded, we'll determine with Chemours if a phase 5 is needed. And the Department of Environmental Quality staff also continue to spot check sampling private wells behind Chemours.
Okay. Well, the other thing, I think, what would you say, just generally speaking, the department is doing to be sure that the people in that area have clean water and clean air?
Well, I think you touched on some of the actions that we've already taken, and certainly the partial suspension of the wastewater discharge permit back in November led to all of the processed wastewater from Chemours being diverted. It's not going into the Cape Fear River. And so we've seen downstream in the lower Cape Fear the drinking water levels be below the health goal consistently, which is very good news. Second, y'all just talked about the well testing. Obviously, we want to identify all of those wells that may be above the provisional health goal, make sure that those families are put on bottled water. We're actively looking to see what is the long-term solutions, and so those are all first priority efforts, and that's where a lot of our energy is going, to make sure that we are providing that clean water to the citizens. Regarding the air emissions, we have been pushing the company hard on what are the ways that they can reduce or eliminate their air emissions, and the stack test information will help guide what those next actions should be in terms of reducing the air emissions and limiting the amount that those air emissions are impacting the community.
Right. And I know you said that y'all want to kind of find the edge of the contamination. You know, have y'all talked to any about what that means? I mean, will it be when everything is below, or will it be when it gets down to a percentage, or is there any, do you know what?
I would say, Steve, when we're looking at environmental contamination, we're trying to define the nature and extent of the contamination. Our first goal, obviously, is to make sure the communities that surround the Fayetteville Works plant have a safe drinking water source. So we're trying to, first off, ensure that we test all private wells that we need to make sure there are levels of GenX in them not above the provisional health goal. What we will do is follow up to making sure everyone has a safe drinking water source, bottled water, then hopefully either carbon filters as an interim measure or ultimately permanent water lines, is we'll then determine the true extent of all environmental contamination around the plant. But first off, making sure the communities are not exposed to these compounds.
Yeah, and I know you are looking at a couple of the Chemours is testing several carbon filter systems, or a carbon filter system, I guess, on several residences, and I know the Cumberland County Commissioners are talking about what it would take to run municipal lines up there. So, okay, let's see. Do we have any other questions, or?
We have gotten some comments on our Facebook asking if, fishing and stuff in the Cape Fear River is okay, if it's safe. What would you say to that?
Well, I think that the fish tissue sampling that Michael spoke of earlier will help guide us in knowing whether this particular compound does in fact bioaccumulate in fish, and we'll be able to say more as soon as those results are back. The original recommendation, if you will, from EPA is that they didn't necessarily believe that GenX would bioaccumulate. Obviously, there were a lot of community concerns, and that's why we started with the fish tissue sampling in Marshwood Lake. So we want to get the results back from that fish tissue sampling, and then determine whether we should require Comores to do fish tissue sampling in the Cape Fear River.
Okay, and the other question we've gotten is about the camps in the area, especially the kids' camps. Do you guys have any recommendations for them?
Camp Dixie. So, and Michael, you can speak to the testing that was done at Camp Dixie last year and the recommendations.
Sure. So that came out of, as Sheila's alluding to, the Camp Dixie work and some of the other recreational areas, including athletic field that's close by to the Fayetteville Works plant. We did hear from the communities in the different information sessions concerns related to those facilities. So we did sample the well at the athletic facility, have sampled Camp Dixie surface water, worked with the Department of Health and Human Services to generate a letter related to the GenX levels in Camp Dixie, and that it would be safe still to use that lake as a recreational lake based on the dermal exposure, and that lake is not used for drinking water purposes. And so that was a collaborative effort with the Department of Health and Human Services. We've actually talked to Camp Dixie recently and have agreed to do a follow-up sample of their lake and continue to work with them to determine levels of these compounds in the lake and make sure they have the information they need to properly inform parents and campers at that facility.
Yeah, I guess it's kind of like the rainwater. You're not exposed swimming as much as you are actually drinking.
I guess that just follows up to the next question. You're saying you can't drink the water and things like that, but people are wondering, the basics like bathing, brushing your teeth. What are the recommendations on those?
Sure. So our staff, and we have a toxicologist on our staff who works with toxicologists at Department of Health and Human Services, and when we receive a well water sample or a surface water sample, we have a group of staff that review that data, and then we generate what's called a health risk evaluation. And for the private well owners around the Fayetteville Works plant, that health risk evaluation describes what the water can be used for out of the private well and what the recommendation is that it not be used for. If the levels of GenX are above the 140 parts per trillion provisional health goal, it still is allowed per that form or recommended to the homeowner that they can use it for bathing, they can use it for laundry purposes, but they shouldn't ingest it making coffee, making tea, or even for cooking purposes. So that form clearly lays that out. But to answer the question directly, it's a suggestion to not ingest levels above 140 parts per trillion, but other purposes and uses for the water would be allowed.
And then this is the question we've gotten most of all has been, you guys are testing everything and all that. You've determined that, the plant is a part of the problem. Why hasn't the plant been shut down while you guys are doing the testing?
I think that's certainly an excellent question. I would say that the agency continues to look at all of the available regulatory options that we have before us in addressing this situation, and we are continuing to use those various regulatory options to ensure public health protection. So we continue on that endeavor. Our role is in taking action on permits or restricting permits and in general, and those are kind of the options that we have explored and exercised over time, and will continue to do so.
Okay, I think that's all I've got for Facebook questions.
Okay, well, very good. Thank you for joining us, and thank you Sheila Holman and Michael Scott from the Department of Environmental Quality for talking to us today about GenX.